Are you starting to get the feeling that we're living in societies ruled by the very worst kinds of people? Societies governed by abusers, sociopaths, psychopaths, and organized criminals. The kind of people who'd launch or support yet another war of colonialist aggression and then gaslight you into thinking it's just a war of defense. In other words, a Kakistocracy. Yep, me too. I think that's the grim reality that the Epstein files have helped shine a light on. In this video, we're going to consider the Kakistocracy and its rule. We're going to see how certain astrological techniques reveal both its existence and why we've entered a battle against the Kakistocracy, the soul of planet Earth. Oh, and why that battle will enter a critical phase in 2030. This is World Astrology Report. I'm your host, Dan Waites, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. It's a weird time to be releasing a video about anything other than the unfolding catastrophe in Iran, but this video is actually on a closely related topic. Indeed, it's a topic that helps to explain why we are where we are now. Astrologically speaking, we're in a time of disillusion, a time when the illusions that we had about how the world worked are being stripped away. That's because right now we're experiencing a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Old structures, both physical and mental, are dissolving. The fundamentally illusory, rules-based international order is over. Instead, we enter a new era of the projection of naked power by this very Kakistocracy. Now, because that Saturn-Neptune conjunction is also configured to the outer planets, Pluto and Uranus, there's a quality of awakening accompanying this process of disillusion. This moment is apocalyptic in the sense that the veil is falling away. And there's actually another astrological factor that I think tells us specifically why we're living in a Kakistocracy now. I'll get into that later in the video. We're going to have to start once again by talking about the world we live in and the Epstein files. Broadly speaking, the picture that emerges from the files is the following. In certain quote-unquote elite circles, abuse of children is not only rife, but probably just table stakes to enter them. Why would that be? Well, consider this. Many of the people operating in the upper echelons of today's global corporate banking militarist empire are sociopaths and psychopaths. They're not like you and me. They see compassion as a weakness. They lie, they deceive, they defraud, and they consider that that's just how the game is played. And of course, the thing about this kind of person is that they can't be trusted. They would betray each other in an instant if it could give them an advantage. So how is it that they can work together? Well, that's where all the abuse comes in. They're kept in line because they've done terrible things together, things that are recorded as compromat. Hello, Jeffrey. People have pointed out that you don't see Epstein threatening people in this way in the files. Well, I don't think explicit threats were even necessary, or if they were given, only seldom. These people know what they've done together, so they can trust each other because of a sense of mutually assured destruction. They've done things that are so bad that there can be no chance of their rehabilitation if they're revealed. And something else that gets strong confirmation from the Epstein files is that there are transnational power structures that operate above politics. The people you see in government are not ultimately in charge. Of course, this isn't news to anyone who's read the conspiracy literature, but it's something that most people still haven't come to terms with. If you're trying to get up to speed, read some Jim Mars. Rule by Secrecy is a good place to start. Now, people are focusing on the lurid parts of the Epstein story for understandable reasons, but they're missing a vital part of the picture. What role did he really play? And here, I want to refer you to a Substack called Escape Key, which has gone through the files in forensic detail and pulled out a picture of what Epstein's role in the world really was. And the truth seems to be that he served as a connecting node between many of the most powerful people and institutions in the world. He got people together and got them to do deals. And he seems to have had a particular agenda. He was pushing towards certain goals, including the creation of digital currencies, global governance, and transhumanism, not to mention support for Israel. And here, I want to explore something about Epstein that you might not be aware of, because the files also reveal that Epstein was hugely influential within a particular globalist organization, one that many already suspect as being a key driver of some of the worst tendencies of the modern world, the World Economic Forum. If you're enjoying this video so far, please show this channel some support by clicking the like button down there. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and enable notifications. That stuff really helps me out and I appreciate it. Thanks. The World Economic Forum was founded by real-life James Bond villain Klaus Schwab in 1971. It's best known for its annual meetings at Davos in Switzerland, where the most soulless people in the world get together and talk publicly about things like global governance and digital transformation. But the public part isn't what's most significant. It's the meetings behind the scenes, the agreements made, the connections forged that are presumably what they're really all about. And guess what? Jeffrey Epstein was hugely influential on the World Economic Forum from behind the scenes, something that the Escape Key Substack lays out clearly. For example, Epstein was actually choosing people to be selected as World Economic Forum young global leaders. These are essentially promising young sociopaths with the globalist seal of approval, who are then sent out to take senior positions in government and corporations and civil society, and so on. In 2017, Schwab boasted of how proud he was that the WEF had, quote-unquote, penetrated the cabinets with its young global leaders, and how more than half of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet were indeed young global leaders.
What we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
I don't want to pick on Canada, but I can't help but note it's now the world leader in medical assistance in dying, which now accounts for 1 in 20 deaths in that country. Depopulation and eugenics, anyone? Other examples of WEF young global leaders include Emmanuel Macron, Jacinda Ardern, and Google founder Larry Page. Wonderful specimens all, I'm sure you'd agree. It started to become very clear over the past decade or two that the kind of people who are winning power in many countries are invariably tied to the WEF. For example, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, now with an approval rating of 18%, the lowest in British history, is a big WEF guy. He was once publicly asked to choose between Westminster and Davos. His answer was Davos. That tells you everything you need to know about him, I think. And it tells you something about the Kakistocracy. They're more loyal to transnational power structures than to the countries that they claim to represent. But is Davos really that bad? Well, let's consider some of the things that WEF minions have said there, because that should tell us something of the culture that this organization fosters. For example, here's smirking WEF futurist Nita Farahani describing technology to directly induce pain by stimulating people's brains.
Once we understand the circuitries that cause pain, I guess the question is, could we then instill pain and use that in many coercive measures in the legal system as well?
Some people call that torture. And here's WEF bioethicist Matthew Liao proposing an ingenious method to cut down on global meat consumption.
So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine proteins. And there's actually analogs of this in life. There's this thing called the Lone Star tick, where if it bites you, you'll become allergic to meat. I can sort of describe the mechanism. So that's something that we can do through human engineering. We can kind of possibly address really big world problems through human engineering.
Cards on the table, I'm vegetarian, and I think it would be good if people ate less meat. But the idea of achieving that non-consensually by using bioengineered ticks and allergies is self-evidently evil to anyone not suffering from transhumanist brain rot. Unfortunately, that's precisely the condition that the Davos set are suffering from. Make no mistake, the WEF's agenda, besides ensuring that corporate goons are in total control of our societies, is transhumanism. The WEF's court philosopher, if you can call him that, is of course Yuval Noah Harari, author of books like Sapiens and Homo Deus. Part of Harari's job is to talk up the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is essentially the idea that human beings will merge with machines and genetically engineer themselves to become superior specimens. Here's what Harari thinks about you if you're not on board with that agenda.
If you're left behind, you're facing something far worse, which is to be completely irrelevant. They won't even need you as a serf or as a slave.
I think it's very telling that these people feel that they can say things like this at Davos. It speaks to their character and understanding of what people around them expect to hear. Again, the WEF is a vehicle for promoting global corporatism, which essentially means rule by corporations. Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, is widely credited with saying the following: "Fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism, because it is a merger of state and corporate power. That's the world we live in. If you're worried about a looming return to fascism, well, I'm afraid the truth is it never left. It just adopted a disguise. Almost every aspect of society is being poisoned by the corporatists who run the world. The medicine, the food we eat, the air we breathe, our minds, our children's minds, you name it, they want to unshitify it. And these are the very same forces who are pushing to create a basically unimpeachable digital control grid powered by AI and able to maintain constant and complete surveillance on all of us. Anyone with their eyes open has seen what that technology has been used for over the past couple of decades. It's been used to hypnotize and lobotomize the global population with highly addictive social media. And yet they somehow think we should agree to merge closer with technology. And if you read Escape Key's articles, or many others, you will see that Epstein himself was working towards this goal. Now, I know all of this is grim, but the first step to changing reality is facing it. And we're going to see later in the video why there are grounds for hope that we can change direction. Now, let's get back to the astrology, because there's an astrological factor that actually shows us why we're now living in a world dominated by sociopaths. And the answer is found not in a conventional form of astrology, but in a modern school of astrology invented in Germany in the 1920s. Uranian, or the Hamburg School of Astrology, was first developed by German astrologer Alfred Witter in the 1920s, and it works quite differently to most other forms of astrology. One of its stranger facets is that it uses 8 very slow-moving hypothetical planets that haven't actually been discovered and probably never will be. Cupido, Hades, Zeus, Kronos, Apollon, Admetos, Vulcanus, and Poseidon. Their positions were inferred through a process of astrological reverse engineering. I know that sounds crazy, but many of those who've worked with Uranian astrology swear by it. And I've seen myself that these hypothetical planets really do work. How could that be? Well, it's theorized that what they really are is barycenters, meaning centers of gravity for planetary matter in the solar system, including things like asteroids and dwarf planets and so forth. Another way of saying this is that there are more rhythms to the cosmos than physical planets themselves can describe. Now, I became interested in Uranian astrology after making a video with the veteran astrologer Bill Meridian, who uses Uranian planets extensively in his own astrology. And Bill said some very interesting things in that interview that speak to the theme of the Kakistocracy. In particular, he told me about a conversation he had with Udo Rudolph, the late head of the Hamburg School, referring to the coming conjunction of 2 of these planets, Kronos and Hades. Here's what he said.
But the years 2030 to 31 are essential because the patriarch of the Uranian School of Astrology, the Hamburg School, was Udo Rudolph. And the last time I saw Udo, he said, "Hey, Bill, do you know what the most important transit is coming up in the future?" And I said, "The Hades-Kronos conjunction in 2030, 31." And he said, "That's right." And I said, "Because we agreed you'll have to decide between God and Mammon, or God and Satan." Kronos and Hades are Uranian planets. Hades is the higher part of the nature. Kronos is the higher part of the nature. Hades is the lower part of the nature. And this was something that was very much used when I trained to be a psychotherapist. They talked about the higher self and the lower self. So if you look at the Kronos in somebody's chart, it tells you their relationship to their higher self, and it's the reverse for Hades. Right now, we have forming a Hades-Kronos conjunction, and Udo, the worst people will be in positions of power. Hades is the worst, and Kronos is positions of power. And Hades is right now sitting on the USA sun. Those 2 planets will be conjunct out in 2030, 31. They will be on a 90-degree dial equal to Cupido and Ixion. So it's telling me at 2030, and this is Klaus Schwab picked 2030 out of the air, which is when they want to have this program complete. So I think the most important years coming up are 2030 and 2031, and it'll be very much like some biblical or prophecy groups say that there will be an attempt to press everyone into a new world order of government that has very little relationship to God or any supreme deity. So that is the whole picture I'm looking at.
Hades, which has a cycle length of 360.66 years, is said to represent everything low and unseemly, including criminality, dirt, and garbage. Here, it borrows from some of the archetype of Pluto in astrology, but without the transformation and empowerment parts. The cycle of Kronos lasts 521.8 years. It represents executive authority, those who are in charge of the state. In combination, these planets seem to mean rule by the worst people, Kakistocracy. Until recently, I already thought I understood what this meant. I thought it meant that the quality of leadership was poor. And that's true, but what I realize now is that the situation is far worse than that. I think it means that we're literally being ruled by criminals, by people with no morals at all, and by people who are working to agendas that are orthogonal to the interests of those they supposedly represent. This has long been the case, of course, but it's started to become incredibly obvious in recent years, and the Epstein files have blown all this into the open. Here's Jeffrey Epstein's chart, and you'll see that his sun was in an almost exact square with Hades, which is in the 5th house, associated with sex and intimacy. On the 90-degree dial used by Uranian astrologers, Epstein's sun is almost exactly conjunct Hades. Now, the thing about the Hades-Kronos synodic cycle is that it's incredibly long. Their last conjunctions came in the 860s. The cycle lasts almost 1,200 years, so the two planets spend very long periods of time in aspect with each other. Influential astrologer Richard Tarnas has said that you start to see conjunctions coming into effect when two planets are about 20 degrees away from each other. Hades and Kronos reached about 20 degrees from each other in the early 1960s. I find it telling that that was the time JFK was murdered. It's often claimed that that killing marked the moment when the US deep state took control of the country from behind the scenes. Since that time, the two planets have been getting closer and closer until the present, when it just seems very obvious that we're being ruled by absolutely terrible people. And I think you can see the expression of this conjunction in other ways, like in popular culture. We have floods of music that celebrates gangsterism and murder and drug use and sexual debasement. Pop music has always had a somewhat rebellious edge to it, but recently it's gone way past that level. We have a culture where it's deemed deeply uncool, perhaps even taboo, to even point this stuff out. We have ceremonies, opening events and institutions that frequently look more like satanic rituals than celebrations. And then there's the TV. So many of the shows today promote a kind of dog-eat-dog competitiveness, an amoral approach to life. Consider, say, the extremely popular reality show, The Traitors, which, full disclosure, I enjoy watching myself. The premise of the show is that a bunch of people stay in a castle together. Some of them are innocents called faithfuls, and others are selected to be traitors. They hide in plain sight among the faithful, lying to them by day and then murdering them by night. Sound familiar? Isn't this exactly the kind of show a society ruled by psychopaths would want people to enjoy? Or consider all the shows that center around anti-heroes, shows that celebrate ruthlessness and skullduggery. Think of shows like Breaking Bad and The Sopranos and Succession, where almost every character is a sociopath. Again, to be clear, I've enjoyed these shows myself, but I'm starting to see these things from a different perspective. Considering that we live in a society ruled by characters like this puts all this in a different light. Indeed, some would say that the predominance of shows like this is an example of what is known as the revelation of the method, an occult technique where we're told exactly what's going on, what the dark occultists who supposedly run the world are up to, and then are made tacitly complicit in it. Isn't it weird that the mainstream channels don't make shows about, say, saving children from abuse and exploitation, even though the news from recent decades has suggested over and over again that that is a real problem? We've been taught to think that such things are just a moral panic and the concern of unsophisticated rubes. Only far-right conspiracy theorists worry about such things like elite child abuse and grooming gangs and things like that. This is not about picking on liberals, though. As the old cliche has it, some of my best friends are liberals. The reality is that both the left and the right are falling for this. In fact, that's exactly the point, because that's part and parcel of how the Kakistocracy governs. It aims to pit us against each other, both by creating certain problems and then amplifying them in the media. In the bonus section of this video, we look at this question, including how the Kakistocracy uses media and partisan politics and policy to set people against each other, and the astrology that describes this. Now, Hades and Kronos are going to make 3 exact conjunctions in 2030 and 2031, which is the time highlighted by Bill Meridian. And it's notable that the UN is targeting this exact time for the rollout of its Agenda 2030 and the achievement of its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You may be aware that the UN and the WEF have forged a partnership to achieve these goals. Most of them sound like things that no decent person could oppose. But that's very much the method of how the Kakistocracy works. Its fundamental operative principle is to use deception to achieve its aims. What the goals really mean is turning over power to unelected technocrats who get to decide if the goals are being met and how that should be accomplished. And who puts these technocrats in place? Well, that would be the Epstein class. Again, it can be no coincidence that the timing of the Hades-Kronos conjunction aligns with this system being put in place. It's also worth noting that Klaus Schwab launched the Great Reset in 2020 as a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was getting ready to form in Aquarius. Jupiter and Saturn will form their oppositions, marking the culmination and full expression of the cycle they began in 2020 from 2029 to 2031. So again, 2030, 2031 looks like the moment of peak Kakistocratic power. Bill suggested this would be a time when we'll be forced to choose between good and evil. I suspect that this is the time targeted to have a full digital control grid in place, one that will demand total compliance. But is it all doom and gloom? I don't think so. The very fact that the Epstein files have come out and people are awakening to all this stuff is in itself grounds for hope. Don't listen to those who claim it's all part of the plan. If you accept that, then you're basically accepting the idea that there are no forces for good in this world and that evil gets to decide everything that happens. That's not true. And there are some astrological signals suggesting things are going to change. Traditional astrologers from the medieval period on used the planets Jupiter and Saturn to do mundane astrology. They were the two slowest moving planets known at that time. Jupiter has to do with faith, wealth, and justice, while Saturn relates to rules and administration. And you can still use Jupiter and Saturn to do effective mundane astrology, at least as it concerns the visible power structures in charge of governments that are making the laws. But here's the thing. Today, governance isn't left to national leaders and governments. Power, as we've already seen, is held by transnational entities and the people who control them. Think of the notion of the deep state. Think about secret societies. And the deep state is really the domain of Pluto, which was discovered in 1930. But I think that discovery also signified something about human consciousness more generally. It tells us that we're now meant to become conscious of these hidden layers of power. And sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. The same is true of Uranus, which represents the freedom of the individual, and Neptune, which has to do with collectivism. Our awareness of these planets and ability to do astrology with them is in itself a signifier of humanity becoming more conscious of these elements of the collective conscious. But there's more. Whenever Pluto reaches the extremes of its north and south declination, roughly speaking, when it enters the signs of Leo and Aquarius, it spends periods each year going out of bounds, meaning its declination rises above the maximum declination of the sun, which is 23.45 degrees. The astrologer Rosie Finn, who has appeared on this channel in this episode, has done deep research into the history of these out-of-bounds transits going back about 4,000 years. She found that they had a certain character that repeated down the ages. When Pluto is out of bounds to the north, as it was from roughly 1938 to 1953, we tend to see the rise of tyrants who try to build empires and subject the masses to control and terror. When it heads out of bounds to the south, as it did last time in the late 18th century, time of the French and American revolutions, we see revolutions from below and the collapse of empires. Now, Pluto is going to be heading out of bounds to the south every year from 2025 to 2035. But guess what? Due to the geometry of its orbit and that of the Earth, Pluto won't be going out of bounds again for many thousands of years. This is the last time. Something about the Pluto cycle, the cycle of power, is about to change permanently. Now, right now, a totalitarian digital control system is under construction by the powers that should not be. The intention behind that system, which is being constructed by the Epstein class, by the Kakistocracy, is to lock us into a digital prison where it's literally impossible to rebel against the system. You'll own nothing and be happy, and you'll take your shots like an obedient member of the herd. And if you complain, they'll take away your ability to sustain yourself and your family, and they'll be able to do it at the touch of a button. There's not even much need for violence in such a system when you can just quietly make it harder and harder for dissidents and critics to survive without them even knowing exactly what they've done. Kafka described this system many years ago. It's just going to get a global digital upgrade. Now, those Hades-Kronos conjunctions come in 2030 and 2031. And according to Rosie, Pluto actually reaches its maximum southern declination in 2030. So it could be that we'll simultaneously see this system being put in place and the Great Rebellion against it breaking out at the same time, which would make sense. What does it mean that Pluto won't go out of bounds again after 2035? It tells me that some pattern of history involving the Plutonian expression of power, which is power that hides, power that's exerted from behind the scenes, from the underworld, is ending. And I think there are two possibilities here. Either we get locked into a digital control system that we can never escape from, and that Plutonian power becomes overt, not covert, or we rebel and opt out of it or stop it from happening. And I think, by the way, that if we don't rebel, probably some cataclysm will come along to reset the whole story. If you're thinking all this sounds a lot like the story of Atlantis, which according to renowned psychic Edgar Cayce, was destroyed after its rulers became obsessed with black magic, then I think you're on the right track. And at a political level, it seems to me that we're being given two options right now: nationalism or globalism. What both have in common is that they give enormous power to the state. And so whoever controls the state controls everything. My suggestion is that we don't choose either of those options. We choose freedom. We opt out and form communities from the ground up that reject the Epstein class and everything it stands for and reject totalitarianism. That's almost it for this episode. In the bonus section available for members of the channel, whether here on YouTube or at my website, we look at how the Kakistocracy governs, because astrology can also provide us with deep insights into that. Thanks for watching. See you again very soon.